All right, today is April 16th, 2014. This is Brent Björkman, the director of the Kentucky Folklife program, and we are continuing on interviews for the Ranger Lore project. We're looking at the occupational folk culture of park rangers. Today we're at Mammoth Cave Park, and we are going to be talking, doing our third interview today, and I'll let my interviewee introduce herself and her job title, and then we'll go from there.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say you're at Mammoth Cave National Park, Brent.
Did I say State Park?
No, you just said Mammoth Cave Park.
Oh, okay.
So, but I guess maybe we're sensitive about that.
Yeah. Okay, take two.
I am Vickie Carson. I'm the Public Information Officer here at Mammoth Cave National Park.
Okay, Vickie. Can you tell me a little bit about how the park came into your life, maybe your origin story, if you have something like that?
Mm-hmm. I grew up in Wisconsin. I was a Girl Scout all my life, went all the way through high school in Girl Scouts. And we did a lot of family camping. We traveled a great deal. My father was a teacher and had summers off. My mom was a registered nurse, but Dad said no wife of his would ever work outside the home. So Mom was home, but she volunteered for everything under the sun, including my Girl Scout leader. And so we traveled a lot, and we mostly went to national parks and state parks. Mom and Dad were very frugal, and we camped, and we went places for free. So I saw a lot of national parks because national parks don't charge very large fees. And never went to amusements of any kind. Amusements, that meant amuse, that means not thinking. And so we did not go to amusements for anything. It was all nature and culture and history and archaeology, and a wonderful thing that I wish I could have given to my own kids, but taking a month-long trip is just out of the question for working people anymore. But it was a wonderful, wonderful gift that my parents gave to me and my sister. But then I went to college and pursued natural resource management, which involved a little bit of forestry, a little bit of wildlife management, a little bit of soils management, a little bit of natural resource management in general, and then also outdoor education. And then I started looking for a job, and I remember applying for a job in Wisconsin on Door County, which is a wondrous, beautiful place. It was a county nature center. It was going to be a brand new place, brand new building, and at the same time applied to be a seasonal guide at Mammoth Cave. And it was, I was about a year out of college. My mom had been ill, and I'd been staying home with her, and I remember getting the call from these folks at the nature center, and they said they had chosen somebody else. And I turned to my mom, and she was short, but she had lost some height because of her illness. And I remember putting my head way down on her shoulder and saying, "I guess I'll go to Mammoth Cave." So that was in 1978, and now it's 2014, I think. And except for going back for visits, this is my home now. So,
what was that first year like? What were you hired as? And tell me about that first couple of weeks, if that's something you could share.
Yeah, well, yes, I was hired as a seasonal guide, and at that time, and I think still today, new guides get about 2 weeks of training because there's a lot of information to learn about Mammoth Cave, to learn about the underground, the surface, the area, but the Park Service as well. And so there's a tremendous amount of intake that you have to learn just to get started as a guide. And so I had 2 weeks of training, and I was waiting for my uniform to come. I remember there were several of us that year that there was a problem with the uniform company, and I don't think I got my uniform. I started about the 1st of June, and I don't think I got my uniform until about the middle of July. And so they had these horrid, like double knit VIP vests, that's volunteer in park vest that we would wear. It had an arrowhead on it, but it also said volunteer across the top. So I had to wear just street clothes with this horrid sort of gold colored double knit vest. And there were several of us that had to do that, but it wasn't like wearing a flat hat, certainly. And people didn't acknowledge you exactly because you weren't the ranger on the trip. But anyway, and then eventually I got my uniform and
you were trailing. Were you trailing?
Trailing. I had to also guide as well, but it was just different, having to do that without the uniform. The uniform really gives a presence, and it draws people to you. I've noticed that even
there was a difference in July, middle of July, when you finally got that uniform.
Yes.
And that's when you couldn't wear the hat without the full uniform. Is that correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Had to have you never wear just part of your uniform. You have to wear the whole uniform. So your uniform. That's the purpose of the whole thing. So we all look alike.
That's right. Your coworkers during that time, tell me a little bit about the way you worked together, learned alongside the process about that, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There was a large group of us that came in that year, and in hiring seasonal guides, what I've seen over the years, and in talking to the folks that are still in the guide force, they can tell you this better than me, but some years there'll be a lot of new guides that come in, and sometimes just a few. And I think this particular summer is one of those years where we're not hiring any new guides. All the ones who've guided before are returning, and so we don't have to have a new hire. We have rehire training, but not new hire training. So that particular year when I came in the summer of '78, it was one of those years where about 20 new guides came in at the same time. It was a big influx of new guides, and so that's a big responsibility for the old guides who are here, because they have to carry the new guides for a certain amount of time in guiding tours until the new one is ready to step up onto the rock and do the speech. So, because another thing you have to learn is the cave. You have to learn the resource, and here the only way to learn the cave is to be in the cave, and otherwise there's no way to look at a map and say, well, I'll do this here and I'll do this here. It just doesn't work. You have to go there and learn the cave and learn what it looks like, what it feels like, what it sounds like, and where you can fit this many people or this many people, that sort of thing. So, my summer I spent with a man named Duke Jenkins, Charles Jenkins. He was the man that I worked with. He was the man that trained me, and he was a PE teacher from Elizabethtown, and he worked here in the summertime, and he was a tall man and had the sort of the gait of the Duke, John Wayne, and certainly had a southern way of talking, much more southern than the way I talked, being from Wisconsin. And the Duke really trained me in how to give a tour. I did half-day tours, 4 days a week. It was a half-day and a frozen, which now we call the Grand Avenue, but it was the 4-mile, 4.5-hour tour, and then the short frozen Niagara tour. So that was my day. That was 4 days of my week. I did the half-day tour. And then on the Friday of my week, I did historics. So I felt like I barely knew the historic route. I really got to know the Grand Avenue route, but the historic route was like foreign to me, and I really had trouble going in there and guiding in there because I spent so much time. One thing in '78, we were still having the very big crowds. So in the summer, sometimes we had, if I remember correctly, I think we would take 300 people at a time on a half-day or Grand Avenue trip. I think sometimes we took more than that, but I don't remember for sure. But it's a huge number of people, and you really just end up walking them through the cave. You stop just a very few times, and then just walk them through the cave very slowly. And so the Duke taught me the gait. This is the pace you take, and it's a strange game of almost like crack the whip, where if you're walking too quickly in the front, the people at the end have to really run to keep up. So I know the gait of the proper pace for taking, 100 people through the cave or 300 people through the cave. And I think I'll always remember that pace of walking along. It's plodding, it's slowly, but that way it's just a management tool of, managing where the people are and how bunched up they are or how spread out they are. But so to me, so much of a cave tour is allowing people to see it and to see it comfortably. And as a guide, it's my job to enhance their experience in the cave. The cave tour is not about me. The cave tour is not about the interpreter. Certainly the stories, the descriptions, answering questions, that's all very important. But the people come to see the cave. They come to see the park. And what we are here to do is to help them see it and help them understand it.
You learned the gait from Duke. Did you also learn the narrative at the different points where you stopped with people from him? Was it tried to copy that, or what was the process of you becoming Vickie Carson, her guide?
The narrative on the tours. I studied. I certainly studied geology and the history and the prehistory. And there were certain things that we would pick up from one another that helped provide, I guess you'd say, I heard some people call it edutainment, so that you're not dry as dust as you're talking to folks. But I always tried to speak to them very openly, very honestly, and I think at first I maybe did some stories mimicking the Duke or mimicking other people I worked with, but I soon found that the Duke, who was over 6 feet tall and had this southern accent, could get away with some things that just didn't translate to me. So I had to find my own way of speaking and telling the story. One person that had a really profound impact on me in speaking and writing was taking a class with a gentleman named Arthur Palmer, and he's a geologist. He literally wrote the book on Mammoth Cave geology. And I took one of the Western Kentucky University in the Park classes. I think it was in 1980, and it was just the Mammoth Cave geology class. And Art Palmer has a wonderful way of conveying the most complex concepts in simple terms. And I thought, oh my gosh, if I could do that, that's what I want to do. And so, I don't know, I hope I didn't dummy things down for people. And Art never did in what he was doing. But just such a talent of being so understandable, of really helping people connect with the resource and helping them take something home with them that might have just gone over their heads otherwise, but they could internalize it and maybe even apply it to something, around their home. But very talented man in how he can speak and and teach. And he's still teaching. He's a great caver, and he's from New York State and teaches at or I think he's retired now, but he still comes and does the University in the Park class here now, or Karst Field Studies it's called now. He and his wife, both cavers, Peg and Art Palmer. They love to tell the story of how they met. They met caving, and they never knew each other vertically. They just knew each other horizontally. And like it was something very racy, but it wasn't, you know. They just were crawling around together in caves, and that's how they met. But two great people, and Peg is always there when Art's doing a class, helping him out.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very knowledgeable and just talented, really talented.
It's a close group of people, it seems, over the years. So thinking of Peg and Art, you just spoke of, I know you're married to somebody who works here.
Mm-hmm.
And how did that happen? Was it here that you met? Or?
Yes.
It was, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Bobby Carson.
I need a drink of water.
Sure, of course.
Bobby Carson.
Your husband, yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Did you have similar jobs, or was he interpreting as well, or was he doing something?
No. I guess, well, I lived in the seasonal apartments here that first summer. And so that's a group of, 24 people that live in the seasonal apartments. Bobby had a full-time job here at the park, monitoring radon gas. It was something that had been discovered in the cave in 75 or 76, I can't remember, and they hired him on then to monitor radon gas in the cave. And he would hang out with the seasonals. He was still a young man himself, and I think when I came here I was 23. So there were a bunch of us. We would either be out there in the evening doing something, or we'd go to Bowling Green, and you have to remember this was disco time. And we would line dance and disco dance and go listen to music, so anyway, there were a bunch of us in the summer that just all went out together, and Bobby was one of those, and I was one of those, and we'd have barbecues and stuff. And then when fall came, the seasonal jobs were gone, and the complexion of the place changes a lot when the summer's over with, because the summer guide force can be up to 70 people in the summertime, and then in the dead of winter it goes down to about 10. And again, ask others who are over there now for these numbers exactly, but that's about what it is. And but along in the fall, there are people who either go back to university, or they go back to their teaching jobs, and then they come out on the weekends to work. So I had a chance to take a job and stay in Kentucky, and it was a job called the the Young Adult Conservation Corps. There was one of those camps here in the park, and it was a daytime job, and so I took a job with that and stayed here, and called home and said, I'm going to stay. This job will last me about a year, and I'll see what I have then, but anyway, so I was going to stay. And so the group that we all went out together with just got smaller and smaller and smaller. And then just one day we looked at each other, we thought, well, he said, well, you want to go to a movie? I said, yeah. And so we did. We started dating, and that was in September, and we married the next May.
Nice. So you made your careers here. You met here, made the careers here, and stayed here for quite a while.
Yeah. Well, I worked for the Young Adult Conservation Corps for 4 or 5 months, I guess. And then I was applying for jobs with the Park Service here. This wasn't a Park Service job. It was just like a project sort of job that was here. And so I applied for jobs here and then also at Lincoln's Birthplace. And I got an interpreter job at Lincoln's Birthplace in February. And I started there on Lincoln's birthday in '79. That was my first permanent job there.
In '79, and then stayed there for a number of years.
I just stayed there for about 9 months, and I came back here. So, but after we married, then we lived in Horse Cave, and I drove north, and he drove south. So, and we lived in Central Time, but I worked in Eastern Time. It was one of those fast time, slow time things. So, I left for work really early, but I got home before I left.
Right. Got it. And a lot of it's an interesting park. Mammoth Cave National Park is because they're like some state parks, talking to state park workers. There are people that have been drawn from this area and they stay in this one place, and you seem to have been drawn there, but you did leave for a period of time due to you went to another national park or in the system of it or something. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. Well, I worked at Lincoln's Birthplace that short time, and I'd like to say something about that too, Brent, just because it's a small park, it has a small staff, and it's history oriented. Here, we're more science oriented, but in that we do these long walking tours, it's also recreation. And so the interaction between visitors and rangers here is quite different than at Lincoln's Birthplace. What they do is much more formal. People come and see that granite set of steps out up to the memorial building and go inside and see the cabin there, and it's just a very formal feel to it, and people speak in hushed tones, where here in the cave say, "Hey, hey, Ranger, tell me something." It's very casual here, where it's interesting as you go across the Park Service what kind of interaction or almost mood or aura, surrounds each park. It's quite different.
Is that one of the things that drew you to this park after?
Well,
you called it casualness, but just
yes,
the demeanor or the...
Yeah. Well, at that time, I didn't appreciate the differences, and I maybe it was the casualness, or I just wanted to be back down here at the big park. I don't think I fully understood what I could learn there and I could draw from Lincoln's Birthplace. Now I do, and it's funny, we have so many reports we have to make. We're government, we're bureaucracy, and here we have a staff of over 100 people. Lincoln's Birthplace has a staff of about 8. They have to make the same reports that we do. It overwhelms me now to think of what small parks have to manage, and have to do. So
more with less.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Well, that's interesting. I guess these thoughts about thinking this through, the type of park characteristics, has come over time as you've been part of this all. And
yes.
You were out west in a different capacity, but not in a park or in a...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we moved west. Bobby applied for this job. It was kind of a dream job in Denver. It was a Washington office located in Denver, if that makes any sense at all. But that's, how things are done. But it was working for the Air Resources Division, which is a Washington level office, but it was located in Denver. So we were both GS7s here in the park, which is, it's a sort of a technician level job. And he applied for this job, and it was a 9, 11, 12, which would take you up into like middle management kind of level. And those jobs just don't come along. I mean, like ever, never. I don't know as I've ever seen a 9, 11, 12 announced anywhere ever again. but they happened to be looking for field people to come into this office. So he applied for it and he got it. And we had just had a baby. We had bought a house. And it's like, what do we do now? So we thought, well, we gotta go. And so we did. And so I went out and looked for a job as well. And the superintendent who was here at the time was Dave Mihalik. And he knew the regional director in Denver. And Bobby wasn't working for the regional office. He was working for this other office, but it was also located in Denver. But there was this regional office that took care of coordinated work for 6 states. And so I applied there into the public affairs office. And they asked me for a sample of writing and an interview. And so I went and interviewed with my baby. And they accepted me. So, and there, my eyes were open to a whole different type of work in the Park Service because it was a regional office. And because I had worked in a park, by then I had worked here. I guess we went out in '89. And so I had worked in a park for 10 years. And while I was here, I worked in interpretation, but I also worked in resource management here. Joy Lyons and I were called split employees. So 6 months of the year we were in interpretation, and 6 months of the year we ran the campground. Joy was in interpretation in the wintertime and ran the campground in the summer. Excuse me. Joy was in interpretation in the winter and ran the campground in the summer, and so I was just the opposite. So I was in the cave in the summer, and when there was so much going on, and I could guide any tour that was available. So I did like Wild Cave, and I did evening programs and hikes, surface hikes and nature walks, that kind of thing, as well as doing cave tours, other cave tours. But in the wintertime, the campground got really quiet, and so I would go out with some of the other rangers and check cave entrances or go on the river. Checking cave entrances is you'd have to hike out into the woods using your compass and map, because there wasn't a trail there, and find a cave entrance and then just see if there's anything that had changed around it. If it was gated, then you'd check the lock and make sure it was okay and sound, and then just make notes about these things. And I was also in with the law enforcement guys, the law enforcement rangers at that time, and every year they had to do a 40-hour law enforcement refresher. And so they always had me sit in with them. And I got so paranoid through that period of my life because there are horrible things that they have to be aware of and deal with on a daily basis. And they encouraged me to become a law enforcement ranger, but I never wanted to. I don't want that kind of responsibility or to have to keep that kind of mindset. It just it was unpleasant. I learned a lot of stuff, but I didn't like it. But anyway, so I had all this park experience. And so when I went to the regional office and was working with, it was the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah. Those were the parks in those states. So there were really big parks, but there were really small parks too. And people in the regional office seemed to seek me out. Even though I was a low-level employee, they'd seek me out and say, "Oh, so you're from a park. You've worked in a park." Because a lot of people had never worked in a park before. and they seem to value just what I might think of something, or how would a park take this kind of thing.
Hands-on experience.
Yes, yeah.
Practical person.
Practical experience, that's right, yeah. Let's see, there I had to do congressional briefing statements. I had to keep up on media and what was in the media about the parks. I briefed superintendents. I was very much a staff person, doing what either my boss wanted. There were two of us in the public affairs office there, and then he worked directly for the regional director. And it was very interesting to see that dynamic and to learn what a regional office does. If you're only in a park, you think, what do those people do? But it's a very different, very needed, very necessary work to keep parks running. So much of it is administrative. So much of it is budget, personnel, and for for a park like Abraham Lincoln Birthplace, where they don't have like a hydrologist on staff, or they don't have an archaeologist, or they don't have an engineer, they don't have a planner. All those people are in the regional office for them, and certainly for Mammoth Cave we rely on those people as well. But it was interesting to see to work at a regional office and to sort of brush elbows with some of the big boys.
And then you did that for a period of time, but then you returned to park life.
Yeah, we were there for about 5 years. And then it was in the early 90s when, during the Clinton administration, there was a downsizing of the federal government. And offices were the first things that were downsized. And Bobby and I were both in offices. And we saw the writing on the wall. And by that time we had 3 children, and we really wanted to get back east. We didn't enjoy the desert all that much. The mountains were okay, but we didn't ski, and we just weren't big on the mountains. We enjoyed them, but and it was so dry. Here you get, in Mammoth Cave it gets 52 inches of rainfall a year. Well, in Denver it was 15, and we had a schedule for watering our lawns, whether you're on the odd or even side of the street. It was very different. And so we were anxious to get back east again. And my folks had passed by that time, and Bobby's dad had, so our only grandparent was his mom, and she lived here in Kentucky. And so we were hoping to get back here. And so we were able to come back, and but it was a difficult move, and it Park Service wide, there are a lot of people who are couples in the Park Service, but many of them don't live together. They work at different parks, and we had seen that with friends of ours, where their entire married life, their entire career life, not married life, career life, they hadn't lived together. And so when we went to Denver, we went with the priority that we would be together. That why be married and have a family if you're not together? We just didn't get that. So that was our priority. And so we were able to come back, but there were bumps in the road certainly when we got here. And the park hired me, and Bobby was hired by the regional office, but he was able to work here. But at one time, they wanted him to, pick up and move to Atlanta, and anyway, that passed, and finally the park hired him as well. And so we decided we were not going to try to move again. And now we're, getting very close to retirement, and we've made it.
And so that's when you cut your PIO chops out there. You learned your press releasing and creating dialogue and discourse between the people you needed to bring together and keep apart.
Yes. One of my greatest lessons out there, I was talking to my boss about something, I have no idea what it was now. And I really had a gripe about it, and it wasn't right. You know, there was something that just wasn't right about it. And he said, well, why don't you go talk to the regional director about it? So I said, okay, I will. So I did. And I went in, and it was Bob Baker. And I went into Bob Baker, and so I laid the whole thing out to him. And it took several minutes to do this, and he just looked at me and he said, well, that's all well and good, but what do you want me to do about it? And I didn't know what to say. I was just like, well, I just have this gripe, you know, but I didn't say that, but, you know, it was like, I have no idea what I said because it took me so off guard, and I thought, oh, I'm so ill-prepared. Why in the world did I do this? You know, I just wanted to slink out of the room. but that was one of those moments that has really prepared me for working with management, because when you go to your manager and give them a big gripe, you know, it's like, well, do you have a solution to this whole thing? You know, you're the one who's right in it. Is there some solution to what you're telling me? You know, so I always remember that moment.
And
yeah. So and I was just left there.
slack-jawed.
Yes.
Agape, yes.
Agape,
Nice.
yes. Certainly. So now in my
So
job.
were you hired as a PIO here when you returned?
Yes, I was. There had been a PIO here, and she moved on, and so that position was open, and I was hired back as a PIO here. Now, while I was in Denver, I had moved up the ladder, and my boss, it was funny, he said, I am so impressed with you. And what he was so impressed about is I would do what he asked me to do. I thought, this is like one of those things you learn in kindergarten, you know? Okay, I'll do what you want me to do. And he loved that. And so he would ask me to do a menial thing, I would do that. He would ask me to do something more complicated, I would do that. He also really taught me how to write. He came out of the newspaper world. And, you know, there's no such thing as writer's block. You write, and you get it done, and you get it all in there. You know, you get the whole who, what, where, why, all that in the first sentence, and you break it down from there. You know? And so it was wonderful to work for him, and sometimes I felt like I could just tap into his brain and download it into mine, and he had a great strategic mind. And I remember he would write speeches for the regional director, and the one I remember the most was when the regional director was a woman. It was Lorraine Mintzmeyer, and this man's name was Ben Moffitt, and Ben knew Lorraine very well, and he would write these speeches, and she was Park Service through and through, and I remember him writing these lines like, you know, I think Park Service all day long. It's like whether I'm singing in the choir or I'm putting nail polish on, you know, I'm thinking Park Service all day long. And sometimes he would read these speeches to me, and I think I just wanted to stand up. It was so patriotic or something. I'd want to stand up and walk around the room with the flag and just wave the flag. But he had a great talent and could write different ways for different occasions, and I just really learned a lot about writing from him. It was a great experience, and I've certainly used that a lot now in my job, because I write news releases, I write stories, I write briefing statements, I write reports, I've started into writing plans, just a lot. And another person I've learned a lot from is my colleague Trace Seymour. He's another great writer and great editor and critiquer. But another thing Ben Moffitt did for me is he would read my writing, and he wouldn't tell me how to fix it. He'd just say, you need more detail here. And he would tell me why I needed more detail. Or he'd say, I think you're going the wrong direction with this. But he wouldn't say what to do. He would just give me a direction, I guess, and then I had to figure it out for myself. It was excellent.
And when you brought something back that was working in his mind, he would say, "This is much better," or
Yes.
"There you go."
Yes, yeah. It was excellent teacher.
So coming back here as the PIO for Mammoth Cave, your interpretive, I mean, I'm sure you used things. It helped enlighten you to how to write better because you had that first-hand experience. Was it different? Did you have friends here that you returned and now you have a different job? Was it hard, easier, just different?
It was different. And I came back, I wasn't in uniform either. I hadn't worn the uniform in the regional office. And it was a while before I got in uniform. I think I was actually still on maternity. I think I had just had a child, so maybe that's why I wasn't in uniform. But I wasn't in a uniform for some time before, when I came back here. And so that was odd. That was different. And then I was in an office job instead of being out in the park, either in the cave or out on the surface. And some people assign your worth as to how much you're out of your office, that you need to be out in the park. And, it's a personal opinion. And so I got that from some people, well, what are you doing here? You're not doing something, And yet the office work is necessary right along beside the field work. You have to have both. You have to do both. And more, reporting is required so much more of government now that even people who are in the field spend a lot of time at their desk reporting what they see in the field.
And you had this very fuller look because you'd been there and saw that cog part of the machine is needed. So
that's right. Yeah. I had a different perspective. Uh-huh.
How about? So was there pay equity there? I mean, I was thinking about like if you're do you know or do you not know? I mean, it was like, do you think they paid you the same as you would for a gender equity, or maybe?
Let's see. Let me think. Get another sip. In my jobs, I think there's always been pay equity. Looking back on the early days of guiding, the guides had a stigma locally that I found out about after I started working here, that that me as a woman coming in to work with the male guides, that was something I shouldn't do. I didn't know this when I was back in Wisconsin. And certainly I wasn't the first woman to walk in and work with the guides. But being a woman in a pretty traditionally, or a traditional male role of either guiding or rangering is sort of different. And I've worked mostly with men all through my career, and I just recently got a woman boss, and I wondered what that was going to be like. But it's worked out okay. We both put a great importance on hair appointments, and but there was some sexual harassment. There was some sort of kidding that was a little too much of a jibe, When I rangered, the guys all respected me and we had a great time working together. But sometimes they'd call me satchel ass. And it really didn't. I can't remember if it offended me or not. I don't think it did, but that was one of their nicknames for me. It was a different time period, and I don't think that would be acceptable now.
So it was you said like 78 into as we went
In
into
the early 80s, yeah.
So talk about that, and I think you're leading me to a movement over time and a change in this. Maybe I'm not sure. It seems from others that I've talked to that there was a definite change from about that period.
Mm-hmm.
And what is it like today, or is there a graduated period that you can even identify, or just? And now today it's...
No, I don't know. I think it's something... I think there was this sort of... There was a stigma with the guides, or there was a perception with the guides. And I don't know that it could be held to be true in all cases, certainly. There were a few, but not in all cases. And... I can remember this one would say, "Oh, look at that young girl. She just needs a few more ice cream seasons." And then they'd sort of the men would sort of look over the new guides coming in, to see what the new guides looked like in the new season. And after a few seasons, you caught on to that pretty darn quick, and thought, "Oh, I was one of those new guides at one time," back a few seasons ago. But I think now I think there is better equality, and I think it's something you have to be watchful of at all times. And not make assumptions about people or make assumptions about groups of people. Just this week, I was working on something about somebody's coming here. She's writing a book about slavery and the Underground Railroad. And we really don't have any history. We don't have any narratives. We don't have letters. We don't have anything that points to Mammoth Cave being used in the Underground Railroad. So I was a little put off with this because I thought, well, and I told this author this, and she said, "Well, but just because there's no evidence doesn't mean it didn't happen." And so I explored that, and I explored that with colleagues here and in the regional office in Atlanta. And then I spoke with the Underground Railroad coordinator in Atlanta. And it's messing with my mind because I've thought, well, this is something I know. These are the hard facts. This is what we know. That Mammoth Cave was operated as a business. There were people going and coming on cave tours all the time. But certainly there are caves all over here. Mammoth Cave is 400 miles long, but that's just one of 400 caves in the park. And then there are caves just everywhere across this part of Kentucky. And so this woman from Atlanta, the Underground Railroad coordinator, said, well, as I was saying, so I was speaking with the woman who's the coordinator for the Underground Railroad in the Park Service regional office in Atlanta. And she started asking me questions. She said, well, if this author has any information, we want that from her. But you have to think about it sort of in her terms as well, that just because we don't have research to support it doesn't mean it hadn't happened. And really, in this part of Kentucky, from what I understand, it hasn't been fully explored yet. There certainly was some movement, from what I understand, on the Louisville to Nashville Railroad, or Louisville to Nashville Road. But more than that, it just really hasn't been explored. So she said, where were the people coming from? Where were they going? Had they traveled here with their masters? Had they been servants that traveled here? Did they have interactions with the slave guides who were working in the cave, or the other slaves that were working in the hotel? And the author was focusing on the 1840s. But well, I love things that make me think and make me sort of dwell and dig a little bit. And this one has, and so I'm still thinking about, has this uncovered something in me about, brought to light some prejudice that I have in some way? Has it opened up a new way of looking at research, a new way of looking at history? And I'm still working on that. I don't have an answer for that yet, but I'll work with this author tomorrow, and we'll go in the cave and take some photographs.
She's here now.
She'll be here tomorrow morning, and visit with her and ask her these questions and just see where it goes from there. History. One thing we're learning here all along, and there's a lot of things about Mammoth Cave we don't know. And it's not just the length of the cave, it's not just what the cave looks like and where it is, but our history as well. And Joy Lyons would say this so many times. She just knows there are answers in letters in somebody's attic. And answers to questions that we have always asked, like Stephen Bishop. He was such a prominent figure here, and sort of a superstar of the cave guides, the slaves that were cave guides. And yet he passed away in 1857, 1858, and nobody knows what he died of or what the circumstances around his death were. And he's buried here in the park, but it's a gap in history. And so him being so famous, surely it's written down somewhere, or that someone was here visiting and Stephen died while we were here, or was he up at Locust Grove in Louisville, where the owner of the cave, that was his family that owned Locust Grove too, and was he up there visiting, and did he pass away while he was there? But so this different way of looking at this Underground Railroad thing, that's just making me think. That's a good thing.
I think that's what's kind of come across in these interviews collectively, is people are drawn to this place for many reasons, as workers, as rangers. Mm-hmm. And one of them, I think, may be this, is mm-hmm. just to be the exploring. Mm-hmm. Not just the physical exploring, mm-hmm. but I'm just the folklorist that's asking these questions, so it's really interesting. Yeah.
One thing that I love to do in working with authors or working with filmmakers or just other media is to leave that unknown thing out there, and to sort of use that as a theme with them, and to pique their interest with it. Certainly we need to tell young people that there's the unknown is still here, that human beings are pretty darn small and we don't know everything. There's a lot more to learn. And I love working like with Western. There's the microbiology folks down there. They have discovered bacteria in the cave that's not been found anywhere else. And they're called, what is it? Geotrophic, or no, that's not quite right. But anyway, they're rock eaters. They're rock-eating bacteria. So does that change our idea of how long it took for the cave to form? Was it actually eaten out by bacteria rather than washed away by water? So some of these things are pretty fantastic.
Or some of both.
Or some of both, that's right. So, and then the prehistoric people, and just the things that we're still learning about them. We have to work with 7 tribes that aren't present here. Some are in Oklahoma, some are in North Carolina. But they all have a claim to being in this part of Kentucky at one time or another through history. And so as we are working in the cave or working on the surface, and the thing we work with them the most about is if there's an inadvertent discovery, which means if a body or part of a body is unearthed. And that occurs sometimes out in the backcountry. We have over 1,000 archaeological sites in the park. And then it sometimes occurs in the cave as well. So then we have to call up the tribes and talk to them, talk to their tribal historic preservation people, and say what we're going to do and how we're going to handle this. And working with the tribes has been very interesting too, just because it's a completely different culture, a completely different mindset, a completely different concept of time, whether it's time in history or present time, and their concept of the cave, and that the cave represents the underworld where there's darkness and chaos, and the surface represents an upper world where there's order and light, and then wherever there's a connection between the two is a sacred place. So the historic entrance is considered a very sacred place to them. And just getting a better understanding of that has been fascinating to me. But certainly in animals and plants, we have more plants in this park. We have more flowering plants in this park than Great Smoky Mountains does. But not everybody knows about it. And, we have Green River, the most diverse river in the United States. And the state mussel biologist has told me that it's the most important diverse river for mussels in the entire world. There's just these treasures, here in this park, in this place. One thing I learned when I was in Denver about that time was when DNA testing came about. And do you know where DNA testing came from, where that science came from? It came from the thermal paint pots in Yellowstone National Park. There was research done there. Those paint pots, it's a very strange environment. Most national parks, if they're a natural park, have a very strange, unusual, unique environment. And so here we have the cave, and Yellowstone, it's these thermal features that they have there. So there's some enzyme in the paint pots that a researcher found and was developed that into DNA testing. And now, of course, that's like a household word. It's in every detective show that you watch. And for some families, it's something that's used, to find out birthright and that sort of thing. So one thing, my old boss back in Denver, he latched onto this pretty darn quick and said the reason that was discovered was because that had been kept as a national park. It was an area that had been set aside, protected and preserved, not developed. And so everything was continuing in that spot as it had been. So national parks are these little places that are set aside where man doesn't change what's there. Now here, this area was developed. I mean, there were farms here, there were communities and all that sort of thing. But the cave itself really hasn't been developed. And then the river, it hasn't changed, or portions of the river haven't changed through the years. And so in these places, who knows what's there? Who knows what's still there, that it hasn't been changed, hasn't been altered, and it just been as it's been since it happened, since it was created, and it's just there. And who knows what answers are there that humans need answers to. It's a cool thought.
Yeah. And these unknowns, there's still
Yes.
unknowns out there that will help us
Yeah.
as we discover along the way, perhaps.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Well, and you know, I'm a God-fearing person, and God says He gave us everything we ever needed, and so are some of these things maintained in national parks, and we just don't know that they're there. So.
Is it daughters? You have a son too?
We have 2 daughters and a son.
How do they, growing up in this environment, here in the park, National Park, is it something they've been drawn to, repelled by, a little bit of both?
It's funny. A little bit of both, I guess. Excuse me. Well, let's see. This is partly who Bobby and I are. Bobby's dad was a preacher. My dad was a vice principal at a high school. We both grew up with the phrase, "Don't ever do anything to embarrass your father." And so we let our kids grow up not really knowing too much about our jobs. They did because we often did some work at home, or they were aware of what we did. But, they certainly came out here. They went in the cave. I would use them as models sometimes. Ad nauseum, yes, one behind me there. She's grown up now, but there she is. And then the girls decided that they wanted to get the student jobs here in the park. So they're still both working while they're in college. They're both working here in the park. And our older daughter sees it as a good paycheck. And at times she has thought, well, maybe I want to do this. And then our younger one is, she's pursuing a degree in environmental science. And so she's, as she has gone through different courses, she picks our brains constantly about this and that and this and that. And right now she's in toxicology. And there are things that have happened here. Certainly there's the white nose syndrome with the bats. There was a time when we had E. coli problems in the cave with the water dripping in the cave. Just various things, invasive plants that are coming in, invasive animals that are coming in, insects that are coming in. And so she picks up brains about all these different things, and that's been interesting. And then our son, he's 20, and he's an outdoorsman and a sportsman, and he loves to fish. And he doesn't fish here so much; he fishes other places. But I consider him he's on the edge. He might be coming in. I'm not sure. But 1 out of the 3 is a nature nut. So, and Bobby and I are not totally defined by this place either. So they all have bits and pieces of us, different bits and pieces of us.
What are some things that we haven't talked about that you might be thinking, well, you're going to ask me about our work here about this particular thing? Do you have something else that you want to talk about?
I don't know now.
We've covered a lot of ground, and you've shared a lot of really great stuff.
Mm-hmm. There's so many stories about some of the old timers, and well,
I'd love to hear a couple of them.
Yeah. Excuse me again.
Sure.
And it's the stories about the old timers I don't remember real well. There's just a few that I remember, but when I started in the late 70s, there were still some of the original first National Park guides that had been hired in the 1940s and early 50s. And, Jack Borden, Ed Logston, Shorty Coates. I know I'm forgetting who they were, but these were some of the gentlemen that I got to work with. And they were just that first generation Park Service. And that was interesting to know them. And to hear how they presented a cave tour and how they presented the park. And that was fun to hear them and be part of that before they retired. That was cool. There's always been mischief in the guides and trying to make you lose your cool. So, whether it's somebody standing behind the crowd making faces or, while somebody's making their presentation, while they're speaking. Or at the information desk when you have to make an announcement, one of your fellow workers might be pulling your socks down or untying your shoes or, poking you in some way or another, trying to make you lose your water. And it's so much of it is good-natured fun and family kind of stuff. There's one story that I've heard about Franklin Jolly, and I didn't know Franklin Jolly, I didn't work with him, but this one story just sticks in my head. I'm not really good at remembering stories, but this one sticks in my head. It was the winter time, and one man showed up for the 4.5-hour tour. Franklin sold tickets. So he told this gentleman, well, so-and-so is going to be your guide. And he's sort of hard of hearing, so you'll need to speak loudly to him as you go through the cave. So then the guide came to check out how many were on the tour and who was on the tour. So Franklin told him, well, this man came up and he spoke so loudly, I'm sure that he's hard of hearing, and you'll have to speak very loudly to him as you go through the cave. And those two men yelled at each other all through the cave for 4.5 hours. They didn't realize it. And Franklin just ha-ha-ha'd, how do you come up with thoughts like this? How do you come up with schemes like this? But and there's so many more Franklin Jolly stories. And but this is the one that has stuck in my head. But I love that you would, just pull that kind of benign prank on one another. That's wonderful.
Quite the camaraderie.
Yes, yeah. The guide force has always been very close, and in the makeup of the park, if I can think about this right, the guide force makes up maybe 1/4 of the number of people who work here at the park. And then it's larger in the summertime when we have all the summertime guides. The maintenance crew has always been the largest portion of the park employees. And then we have administrative people, science people, law enforcement people, and managers. The guides are the ones that are before the public, so they're the ones who are really seen. The administrative people never get out; they're never seen. they're doing budget and payroll and ordering things and purchasing things, and then the law enforcement people, they're out there, in patrol cars or parking cars, or and sometimes they suit up in camo and they go back in the woods to find a marijuana plot, or a meth factory anymore. And they can deal with some very dangerous situations. Their jobs are such that they have to be ready for anything that might happen in the city, but they have to be the friendly ranger at the same time. It's very tough. very tough. And the maintenance fellas, they keep everything rolling, everything happening, everything in good shape so that people can come here and enjoy 90 miles of trails. I think it's 80 miles of roadway. You know, parking lots, bathrooms, picnic tables, campgrounds. It's a lot to maintain, a lot to take care of. And our science guys are out there doing strange things. You know, they're examining, let's see, they've been doing acoustic monitoring of bats. And through acoustic monitoring, they can tell, I can't remember which instrument they use for what, but they can tell the species and how many and what time they're active and that sort of thing. We've had one researcher come in and put antennas on the backs of bats, like between their shoulders. And he just uses super glue to put this tiny antenna on it, but then they do monitoring of the bats. And eventually the skin cells grow and slough off, and the antenna sloughs off too. But for a short time he can. Weird stuff. Looking at the mussels in the river, looking at the fish in the river, looking at mercury. You know how much bioaccumulation of mercury has occurred in the plants and the animals in the park, and mist netting birds, putting these tiny little very fine nets out to capture birds, and then just look at them, see if they've already been banded, look at their health, look at their age, look at their sex, look at do they belong in this part of the country or not, their general health, and then band them again and send them out. And we have eagles nesting on the river now, and we're monitoring those eagles. They've nested for 3 years and produced 2 young every year. Going in the cave and looking at the airflow in the cave, looking at the cultural resources that are in the cave, taking care of the stone walls that were built by the CCCs. Just many, many, many different things. And then I have my job. And my job is just to boast about the park, which I really enjoy doing. So I try to keep track of all these different things going on, and do stories on different ones, and certainly do stories on activities in the park. And then I try to be as responsive as I can. One thing I should say is the federal government does not allot any budget to national parks for marketing or advertising. My salary is to provide information and to be responsive, but we can't buy ads in any way. So it's the tourism people from around the park and in the state offices that purchase advertising that says Mammoth Cave on it.
So you need to be strategic.
Yes, yeah. Well, and I try to be as responsive as possible, very responsive to almost any, very simple request or big request. Like this week, a lady sent me a note. She does a website for family travel, and she needed a couple of pictures of children having fun in the park. So, guess what I had? Pictures of children having fun in the park, and I got those out to her. She said, "Oh, they're perfect. They're just right." So it's amazing, just the small things I can do to try to connect with people, connect with the businesses outside the park, connect with the state tourism department people, and just how much we can help each other within my boundaries of what I can do. So.
Resourceful and strategic.
Yes. Yes.
Just like writing the variety of stories and placing them in different places that you need to do.
Yes. Yeah. My boss in Denver taught me that. find the right venue for the right story and push it there. So,
Is there anything else you want to tell me before we conclude?
I've told you enough, I think. But this has been
Thank you.
It's been fun.
Thank you. It's great. It's just
Mm-hmm.
we'll end there.